Right, we're just going to give a quick minute here, make sure everyone has a chance to join in at the start. I will kick off the actual presentation in just one quick minute here. Right, looks like the attendee count is slowing down, so I will get things kicked off. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation. Hope everybody is enjoying the Western Canada Information Security Conference experience. And thanks very much for spending a quick piece of your time with me. I know there are many demands on your time, and I appreciate you spending it not only with the conference as a whole, but in particular with me for my presentation here. There is a Q&A and chat window here, so if you have any questions as the presentation goes on, feel free to type anything in there. I will be giving my presentation for probably 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end, 15-20 minutes for questions and answers and anything else that you guys might like to talk about. Yeah, so today my presentation is going to be talking about exploits and vulnerabilities. It's definitely something top of mind for most organizations and enterprises, and one of the prime cybersecurity topics that's coming up very often these days. I'll be presenting some slides that I've actually stolen from one of our threat research experts, John Clay. He has a regular monthly presentation series as well as a weekly blog. So be sure to head over and visit his awesome and informative content at blog.trendmicro.com or resources.trendmicro.com. My name is Gabriel Smythe. I'm a sales engineer, solutions architect, and I'm based here in Vancouver, BC. So I'll start off with kind of a high-level overview of the global state of vulnerabilities and some stats and numbers from the last year for 2020. And kind of related to one of the key components internally with Trend Micro in our research team, the zero-day initiative. If you weren't already aware, the zero-day initiative has been part of Trend Micro since our acquisition of Tipping Point from HP back in 2015, just before I started with Trend, actually. And they are the largest vendor agnostic global bug bounty program. ZDI verifies and purchases newly discovered vulnerability information from over 10,000 independent threat researchers around the world, and then manages the responsible disclosure process with notifications to the impacted vendors to allow them to develop a patch, while simultaneously ZDI develops protection filters and rules for use in the wider range of Trend Micro products. You can see in this chart here that since ZDI started with their first single bug report in 2005, they have pretty steadily grown up until last year, where they managed and disclosed a total of 1,453 bugs. If you look at globally, all the bugs reported by NIST, there were actually well over 16,000 reported for 2020 over the course of the year. And that really speaks to one of the challenges that organizations have, which I'll dive into in a bit more depth a little later on, which is how do you prioritize which vulnerabilities or bugs to deal with? You know, you won't be able to patch for all 16,000 plus bugs, of course, nor would you really want to. Some are related to applications you may not have in your environment you're not using. Some will be bugs on items that don't necessarily require immediate patching or immediate attention. So we'll talk a bit more about making that determination and the prioritization process a little later on. When it comes to severity, you can see here that there was actually a big uptick last year in high and critical severity bugs that ZDI found compared to the previous year. And that can actually be seen as a good thing, not that more critical bugs are being found per se, but the fact that the critical bugs that are out there are being found by us. So because the more bugs that the ZDI affiliated researchers can dig out of the applications, and that ZDI can then work with the vendors to get those bugs and vulnerabilities patched, that means that those vulnerabilities are not going to be available for use by criminals and threat actors or nation states as 0 days to potentially launch attacks. So it's a good thing that we find them. For this graph here, you can see it starts with the same info as the first one, but there's a little number added on to each year to represent the number of actual 0-day vulnerabilities. So these represent cases where ZDI has verified and purchased the bug info from the researchers, but after working with the vendor, and there's a 4-month period to work with the vendor, where the vendor has the opportunity to work on their patch or their fix. But in these cases, with that little number inside the bar chart there, that's the number of cases where the vendors have decided not to release a patch for that bug at that time. ZDI will still publish the disclosure of the vulnerability information. We do feel an obligation that the customers need to know that there is a vulnerability in a product that they may be using. But for whatever reason, and there are a number of potential reasons, the vendor is either unable or unwilling to provide a patch for that vulnerable product. So I note that a large sample of the vendors where this does occur tend to be more in the ICS, industrial control system and SCADA type environment for those sorts of applications and devices. So when we talk about 0 days, what is the difference and kind of the definition between a 0-day and an end day? So as I just talked about, a 0-day is a vulnerability where there is no immediate patch available. So the vendor has not provided a patch. An end day is where the vulnerability has been disclosed, the vendor has released a patch, but there's still opportunity for threat actors to potentially try to exploit these vulnerabilities in the future. And part of the ZDI research work is looking at the exploit kits being used by the bad guys. And we can see that the majority of exploits included in these kits are actually based on this sort of earlier vulnerability. So as you can see in this graph, 2019, 2017, you can even see that there's still significant numbers of attack attempts occurring, which are using vulnerabilities from over 15 years ago. So it really speaks to the real world challenges of patch management that all organizations have at least somewhat of a struggle with. With true 0-day vulnerabilities, when you do see an actual 0-day exploit being leveraged in an attack, it's actually a very good chance that it's nation state type threat actor on the other end. The cost of obtaining the information on these true zero-day vulnerabilities is generally well beyond what an independent threat actor or a typical cybercriminal organization would be willing or even able to pay. It can potentially run from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to acquire that sort of zero-day vulnerability info. So quick summary here of some of the top reported vulnerabilities that ZDI researchers discovered last year. Really gives you an idea of the wide variety of different vendors and vendor products that those researchers are working with. The first one here, Microsoft Exchange Server, remote code execution vulnerability. It was reported by an anonymous researcher. It's a really critical vulnerability in the Exchange server that allows any authenticated Exchange user to gain system privileges on the server. It's found on the Exchange Admin Center web interface. Basically the default, it's available to any user who has credentials to a mailbox on the Exchange server. And it's also exposed on the network alongside OA, the Outlook web access. So relating to the cryptographic keys installed on the Exchange Admin Center, the ASP.NET application, Exchange should generate these keys randomly at install time. So they'll be secret and unique, but instead they were copied verbatim from the install media so that an outside attacker can know these keys by referring to any other installation of the product. So that allows an attacker to forge messages that'll be deserialized at the server, leading to arbitrary code execution. Really, vulnerabilities in Exchange server are really highly significant because Exchange is really at the nerve center of the enterprise. It makes it an exceptionally valuable target for adversaries. Absolutely, if you're using Exchange on-prem and you have not yet applied the patch for this, please do so right away. We do have a ZDI blog that covers that information in a bit more depth there. There's a VMware ESXi SLP used after free remote code execution vulnerability again, discovered by CDI vulnerability researcher Lucas Leong. Of course, ESXi, I'm sure you're all familiar. It's an enterprise class hypervisor, wide use in enterprises around the world. One of the protocols that ESXi uses that's enabled by default is the Service Location Protocol, or SLP. It's a protocol that enables clients to discover networked services. And the most popular implementation of SLP is OpenSLP. What Lucas found is that ESXi is using a custom implementation of OpenSLP. So there were flaws in this custom code that basically led to two critical security issues. One resulted in a message object being freed within the SLPD process message string, despite the program still retaining a reference to the freed object, which is what results in a use after free condition that can be exploited by a remote attacker within the WAN. So it was initially reported by ZDI. The initial security patch that VMware put out actually did not fully address the issue, which resulted in a bypass that was subsequently reported back to VMware in a second ZDI bulletin. And with this one specifically, it should be noted that in addition to being remotely exploitable, the SLP bugs can actually also be used for sandbox escapes by processes running within a restricted environment. So it's really a great example that even really heavily researched, widely used products such as ESXi can contain attack surfaces that are often overlooked that can have really major security implications. Third one here, Apple Safari bug reported during the 2020 spring Pwn to Own competition. It's a regular couple times a year competition for the ZDI researchers where they all get together and basically have a big competition in demonstrating and discovering vulnerabilities and bugs. There's a lot of money up at stake. Back in 2019, I think it was, here in the Pontoon in Vancouver, CDI joined in with Tesla, and part of the competition was looking for the first people to be able to demonstrate a successful exploit of a vulnerability in one of the Tesla Model X's. And the one team actually did achieve that. I believe it was in the onboard browser. And for discovering and demonstrating that exploit, they actually got to keep the car. So that was a lot of fun to watch there. So this specific Apple Safari bug, it was actually discovered and displayed, demoed in the Pontoon by the Georgia Tech Systems Software and Security Lab. It's a portion of a chain of 6 bugs actually that they demoed all together. So I won't go into the full details, but the end result of chaining these 6 vulnerabilities and a successful exploit demo is that the team won $70,000 out of that Pontoon competition. So really the dedication of that research team in finding and exploiting 6 vulnerabilities altogether is mind-blowing. So and really this demo, it all occurs behind the scenes when a victim visits a simple web page. So you can be browsing the web, hit the compromised page, and 10 seconds later, you've got malicious code on your machine. So the next one here, again, demonstrates the breadth of systems that can potentially have vulnerabilities well beyond your typical Windows OS and applications. This one's a Freebsd kernel vulnerability, privilege escalation in this case, reported to ZDI by a researcher who goes by his alias MoonBSD. The bug, high level, allows an attacker to achieve kernel level code execution on FreeBSD, starting from an unprivileged user using a time of check, time of use vulnerability in the 32-bit send message system call. It's really a pretty shallow depth bug vulnerability, and yet it was available for a number of years before it was discovered. So ZDI has a blog from back in September that has all the details, including some information on a POC of a potential exploit based on that. And then finally, we have Microsoft Windows. This one was reported anonymously to ZDI. It's a vulnerability in the Windows Direct Composition kernel mode graphics component. Again, privilege escalation vulnerability. You'll see kind of a common thread in these top vulnerabilities: remote code execution, privilege escalation. It's really the functionality that attackers are looking for to be able to either exploit or cause damage in a customer environment. So really, an exploit of this vulnerability can potentially give an attacker control over the instruction pointer in kernel mode of a Windows system, which can be leveraged to gain system privileges and move from there. So I would like to take a bit of a deep dive into one of the more prominent vulnerabilities, high-profile ones from last year that I'm sure you are all familiar with, Zero Logon. Zero Logon caused a lot of concern, both for the ease of achieving an exploit of this vulnerability, as well as the severity of impact for when that successful exploit was achieved. Classified CVE 2020-1472. It's in the NetLogon Remote Protocol Service, MS NRPC, and it basically allows an unauthenticated attacker to use that protocol to connect to a domain controller to obtain administrative access. And it's basically a pretty simple cryptographic brute force process to achieve that exploit. One silver lining of this particular vulnerability is that it's not remotely exploitable. So it requires the attacker to have access inside the network from a compromised machine already. So silver lining that it can't be exploited from outside the domain. It does affect Microsoft Windows servers 2008 and newer, so pretty much everyone that has a Active Directory domain controller is going to be impacted by this. Some of the key concerns and why it was, again, so high profile. The entire attack process can actually be executed in about 3 seconds. So like I said, it's a very, very simple brute force process. There was proof of concept code that was publicly available online. It was added to Mimikatz. Again, I'm sure you're familiar, toolkit that can be abused by threat actors to easily try to leverage vulnerabilities and exploits. So there was a kit and functionality added into Mimikatz to take advantage of zero logon. And Microsoft did observe threat actors actively using the exploit in attacks. So obviously, we're likely to see continuing and new in the wild exploits trying to leverage this vulnerability. This was labeled by NIST as a critical vulnerability with the highest severity score of a 10 out of 10. The zero logon vulnerability it's an example of potentially how small the window can be from disclosure of a vulnerability to malicious exploit activity to start being seen in the wild. Our friends over at Darktrace have a blog that actually shows the really small timeline in this case. The first command and control beacon observed on September 7th, followed by the public disclosure of the known exploit code a week later on September 14th. And then literally less than 24 hours later, the RPC calls to NetLogon were starting to be seen in customer environments. So less than a day from the exploit code going public to actual attacks happening in the wild. This is a really quick, just graphical representation that kind of shows how simple this exploit is. You can see there's an initial NetLogon request, which allows basically the attacker to log on with admin domain controller access, which will allow the attacker then to change the domain controller password, or they can actually remove the password. So it basically gives them access, can allow them to do a denial of service type attack where they compromise the domain controller, or they can leverage that to gain domain admin privileges and continue their attacks from there. Also wanted to reminisce a bit about the good old days and talk about a couple blasts from the past here. Depending on how long you've been involved in cybersecurity, you will likely be familiar with one or both of these old guys here. You can see in this chart, this is what Trend Micro has observed in monthly detections of downad configure attempted exploits over the course of the last year. So it's a remote code execution vulnerability. It was actually found and patched in 2008. It's very similar to zero logon, also had a severity rating of 10.0 assigned by NIST at the time. So of course, most impacted customers will have patched, but even with that, you can see now, even 12 years later, more than that, it started out in 2020 relatively slowly at the start of the year. There was a bit of a boost in April, and then a big spike you can see there in November, where we did see over 200,000 detections in November of attempts on this vulnerability. The other one I'll point out here is Wannacry. With Wannacry, of course, it came out with a bang back in 2017. But again, even more than 3 years later, you can see that still here in 2020, we're seeing hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million detections every month of attempts to leverage this vulnerability due to infected systems that are still trying to propagate themselves over the networks. So why are these older vulnerabilities still showing up in detections? You know, most organizations, like I said, they've most likely patched for both of these. So why are they still showing up? The one main thing that these specific threats do have in common is that they were developed as worms, which means they're programmed with functionality to be able to self-propagate over the network or over the internet. The good news is if your systems are patched, or if you have IPS protections at the network or host levels, these propagation attempts by the malicious code will be blocked. The bad news is if your environment contains systems with, say, legacy operating systems or operational technology, IoT devices, systems running apps where the vendor may not allow system patching to maintain support. All of these situations can potentially leave systems vulnerable to these older threats that are still reaching out and trying to spread. And then the last bullet point on golden images, where systems may be deployed or imaged from a template. It's obviously much easier for organizations to deploy patches to currently active systems in their environment. And sometimes the processes or policies are not in place, or the opportunities are not as easy to ensure that updates and patches are also applied to the golden images that are used for base builds of different systems. So what could we do? We can be sure that attackers are going to continue to use exploits of vulnerabilities. New vulnerabilities are going to continue to come into play. So what are some options that everyone can do to help mitigate against this? Obviously, I mean, can't be emphasized enough, the main protection you can use against vulnerabilities is to keep your devices, your applications, your systems as fully and currently patched as possible. But of course, as we've mentioned, it's not always as easy as it sounds. Some key considerations to make sure your patching efforts are most efficient and most effective in protecting your organization. Some things we recommend is to continuously conduct an exposure assessment to determine what CVEs, both past and present, so don't forget the old ones, are actually present in your environment at all times. So you're aware of the vulnerabilities that exist local to your organization. You know, remember that the older vulnerabilities are still being actively utilized by threat actors trying to compromise your systems. You want to make an assessment of the criticality of your systems where these CVEs are discovered. So you want to have knowledge and an inventory of which applications are critical to the actual line of business and profitable operation of your company. Because really those are the systems that a threat actor is going to be targeting to try to compromise, to make it that much more likely that you'll be willing to pay a ransom or extortion in the case of a successful attack. You can, you know, use a real simple kind of risk assessment tool, and we have a sample here. So you can create a risk score of your systems to assess which are the highest priority systems that you need to protect with a pretty simple probability to severity risk matrix. So you look at what are the chances that a vulnerability can be used to exploit a system. So if there's unpatched CVEs on a system, you know, what are the chances that they might be exploited? And if it is compromised, what impact is that going to have on the actual operation of your business? How severe is that impact going to be if you lose that system for hours or days or weeks? You also want to look at, consider that there may be a POC available of exploit code available on the internet, or are there actual attacks occurring that are leveraging that vulnerability in other companies? So is it in the wild and being exploited actively? So a sample of that sort of risk matrix right here, it's again really simple: low, medium, high, probability to severity, which will give you you know, kind of a prioritization number that you can use to decide where to apply your efforts first. Another way to look at it, kind of in the aspect of, you know, what vulnerabilities you need to take a look at first. This is based on information from Gartner, so showing that they counted 18,000 total disclosed vulnerabilities in 2020, but actually there were only 473 of those that had exploits observed in the wild, and only 28 of those actually showed widespread exploitation. So, you know, it really kind of looking at it through this lens allows you to sort of focus down on the specific vulnerabilities that really do have that potential of causing damage if they're exploited. So you can think about it as a Venn diagram as well, like on the right there. So you can initially aim for a really tight focus on the overlap of all disclosed vulnerabilities, the ones that are known to be present in your environment from your inventory that we did previously, but overlap that with the vulnerabilities that have known exploits available in the wild. And you can use that overlap targeted information as your main initial protection priority. And then you can expand your efforts out from there. So make sure that, you know, the hours you put in are having the biggest impact in protecting your environment. Just quickly show the overall process here. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just really the timeline of what does happen with a new vulnerability as it's discovered. So initially, a researcher will find a vulnerability, submit it to the ZDI program. ZDI will validate, determine how much it's worth, basically, and make an offer to the researcher to purchase that information. If that's accepted, then the vendor will be notified. So Zero Day Initiative will do a responsible disclosure to the product vendor, and they will start working on that filter or rule to protect against that vulnerability. The vendor then has an opportunity to develop their patch. So ZDI has a baseline of 4 months to allow the vendor to address that vulnerability. And at that point, the vulnerability will either be patched or it will remain unfixed. So if they inform ZDI that they're unable or unwilling to release a patch, then we'll go ahead with public disclosure, and Zero Day Initiative will publicly and responsibly disclose the details of the vulnerability on the ZDI website in accordance with its normal policy. So that gap in between there of the notification of the vendor and their release of the patch and the public disclosure is what allows us to create that virtual patch to provide protection in our IPS products, either at the network or perimeter with Tipping Point, or on our endpoint or data center protection products. Our Cloud One Workload, Deep Security, Apex One all have host level IPS where the protection rules can be applied. So it really gives us a big advantage on providing protection in the absence of that vendor patch. So, you know, that basically gives that delineation of the 0-day exposure and the end-day exposure if there's a vendor patch. And of course, there's the process that you will have as an organization to test the patch, go through your change control, and actually apply the patches on your system. And depending on the capabilities of the bad guys out there, you know, the exploits of those vulnerabilities will likely at some point start here. So whether it's after patches are applied, which is great, or the unfortunate occurrence where there's attacks out in the wild before patches are able to be applied, that really is where that virtual patch concept, the IPS protection, can be a big benefit to organizations. Let's see, I'm gonna skip off a few of these case studies here, just kind of breeze right through, just so we have time for a bit of a Q&A here. Just basically showing the process for a couple individual vulnerabilities and the timelines when they occurred. Skip through. All right. And yeah, just finish off, you know, vulnerabilities and exploits really are just one facet of the wider Trend Micro research team and the spectrum of research that we do. As I mentioned at the start, you can go to blog.trendmicro.com and get a whole bunch of great info from a lot of folks that are a lot smarter than I am on all these different topics. For those of you who don't know, Trend Micro has been in business for over 30 years, focused solely on cybersecurity. We've had consistent vision over that 30 plus years of trying to help to make the world safer for exchanging digital information. Headquartered in Tokyo, Japan, global operations based in Dallas, Texas, and Canadian operations head office in Ottawa. As well, we have a good-sized threat research center. One of the 15 global threat research centers is based in Toronto. So we have some good Canadian content there. Currently have nearly 7,000 employees, 38 business units worldwide, over 50 countries, and we're protecting over 500,000 businesses and governments, including 45 of the top 50 global corporations, as well as millions of individual consumers. So if you'd like to talk to us about protecting your system against vulnerabilities and exploits or any other cybersecurity topic, we've got Bruce and Jay, and I think Miguel, myself, Jerry, a whole bunch of trenders are here at the conference. So visit our vendor booth and pop into the chat room. You can talk to us there, or you can give the wider sales team a shout at the number or the email listed on this slide. So thank you very much. That's my deck. Thanks so much for listening. Look forward to chatting with you about any questions. So yeah, let's take a look. There's not a whole lot in the chat here. Which department should take ownership of continuous monitoring of exposure? That's really hard to say as a global do this, don't do this. It really does depend on your organization and how your kind of org chart is laid out, and where those responsibility lie. If you have, you know, whether it's the infrastructure team or if you have a kind of robust security team that has time, you know, it is one of those things that does take some hours to accomplish. So you have to make sure that it's properly resourced to be able to achieve the desired goals, really. Just had a question pop up here in the Q&A. What can be the best way to mitigate zero-day vulnerabilities? You know, that's really a hard one. The 0 days are the worst options, right? There's by definition, there's no actual vendor patch available for the affected application or operating system. Really, I think, and I kind of touched on it, you know, it's not just Trend products. There's lots of other vendors that have similar competitive capabilities, but you'd be looking at intrusion prevention options in that case to really provide that protective layer beyond what a vendor patch would give. So whether there's a vendor patch hasn't been released yet, or whether it's not going to be released at all, you can have some layer of IPS protection either at the network level, at a perimeter, or at a host level from an agent protection system that can really provide much more timely protection against a number of zero-day type vulnerabilities. So I think that's really the best option there. Trend Micro EDR going to be used for vulnerability management. It's sort of a different functionality. It can definitely be used in the EDR, or, you know, when you talk about EDR, we're kind of, especially from Trend Micro here, we're talking about sort of the wider capabilities of a XDR, where you're adding in telemetry, not just from the endpoints, but also from the network, from your email, from your data center. There definitely is a component that can be used there. You can have a lot of visibility into things like cloud application usage, you know, different data points from the telemetry that a detection and response system will pull in that can definitely assist in that sort of vulnerability management and being aware of what applications might be being used in your environment. And then, yeah, that can tie in with the other protection layer where you can actually apply the protection to that. So definitely for visibility into some systems that are being used in your environment. Yeah, the XDR concept definitely will assist there. Let's see here. Yeah, definitely a note from AK there about the VMware ESXi vulnerability, and that there are some additional mitigations. A load balancer with pre-auth or web access firewall rules. So yeah, definitely some layers, and really I think that's kind of one of the big keys is you know, layers of protection. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. You can't put your IPS protection only on the network. You look at something like Zero Logon, where that vulnerability is actually exploited inside the perimeter of your environment. So a network layer IPS is not going to be able to block that Zero Logon activity of an attacker accessing the domain controller. So that's a case where you might want to look at layering in and have the host level IPS protections, which can mitigate that one. So yeah, layers, IPS, patch everything you can as soon as you can. Really that's kind of the main points I would like to leave you with. Let's see, anything else? Feel free, just type away in the Q&A or the chat. I'm really looking forward to actually doing one of these in person as soon as possible. Very upset that my airline status is going to fall away. I haven't traveled in over a year and it really sucks. Hope everyone is safe and secure and happy. All right. All right, don't see anything else here. So again, please feel free to stop by our booth, Trend Micro in the vendor hall. We've got a chat room in there. You can chat with a number of us that are going to be hanging around for the rest of the conference here. Thank you so much again for spending your time here, listening to me yak away, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all very much.